Hello, Nick Leifker here, and welcome again to Management 409, Operations Management. So far in our examination of project management, we've looked at how to determine how long a project takes given a set of tasks. We've looked at how to find that in case where we have uncertainty, where we have variation in the process. Well, sometimes we have to rush things. We have to hurry things. This is the nature of business. Sometimes we have deadlines. After all, when we were talking about PERT CPM with uncertainty, we were looking at the probability of completing the project before a certain deadline. Well, what if we can't meet that deadline as is? Well, what we can do is we can hurry the project up. In fact, this is normally what we do. We hurry the project up. Now, there's a technical term for that. We call it crashing. So how do we crash a project? Well, we commit more time, more resources, more people to it. So more money. So the question is, if we have to crash a project, how do we do it? Well, we want to save as much money as we possibly can when it comes to crashing. After all, we don't want to blow the bank on this project. We've seen projects over the years that have bankrupted companies. So we want to keep it as small as possible. We want to keep the budget as small as possible while still spending enough that we're able to hurry this project and get it done on time. So, how do we do that? So, let's take a look at an example and just work through this example. In fact, it's the example that we looked at before. That first case with 6 tasks going on. Now, suppose it costs us $1,100 a week to keep people working on the project. Moreover, we decided that we want to finish the project within 11 weeks. So we need to hurry it. Now, to accomplish this, we allow the possibility of crashing each of the tasks for a particular cost. Now, that said, what tasks should we crash to minimize that cost? After all, if we're going to be committing more time, more resources, more money to it, we want to spend our money wisely. Well, how do we do that? So here's the information we have. We have the set of tasks, A through F. We have the predecessors, of course. We have the length of time that it takes normally. And we have two other pieces of information. And it's important to note how this information is presented because there are variations in how this information is presented. We have the crash cost. So what is this? This is the cost to completely crash the project, to take it from however length of time it takes normally to the length of time it would take when fully crashed. Now, the other piece of information you may be given in one of two forms. And it's important to note what that form is when you're working the problem. So we could be given the number of weeks that we can crash it, which is what we're interested in, the number of crash weeks. Or you could be given the length of time for that task when it's fully crashed. Either one could be given to you. So if you are given the number of weeks that the project takes when fully crashed, you simply just take the normal length minus the crashed length to find the number of weeks that the project can be crashed. You see, it's those crash weeks, the number of weeks that the project can be crashed, and the crash cost, the amount of money it takes to fully crash the project. It's these two pieces of information, along with a few other things, that we're going to use to figure out which task should be crashed first. Now, here's the project as we solved it before. We have our critical path, we have early start, earliest finish, latest start, latest finish, and of course we have the slack. And so based on this, what should we crash first? Well, we need to think about a few things. First of all, to hurry anything outside of the critical path, does that help us? Well, no, it doesn't, because they already have slack. They already have extra. We don't need to give them more. So the only things that are going to help us is to crash tasks on a critical path. And note that I say tasks on a critical path, because we may end up finding ourselves with more than one, as we shall see. So, you have to be sure that the task is on the critical path. That's the first thing. And so, what else? Well, we are looking for bargains here. We don't want to spend too much money. So, we want to look for the task that has the smallest crash cost per week that's on the critical path. That, more to the point, that crashes all the critical paths, as we'll soon see. So, clearly, we have some options, but we need to choose the best one. So, for this particular part of the course, it's a good idea to use the PERT CPM calculation tool provided in Blackboard. Now, some of you, I suspect, have probably calculated this by the PERT CPM stuff by hand up to now. That said, well, it's a good idea to use the calculation tool in Blackboard now. And the reason why is because it will save time. It will save an incredible amount of time. The reason for this is that with crashing, the calculations that we normally perform with PERT CPM will need to be done repeatedly. So you will work the same problem over and over and over and over and over again. The question is, do you want to do it by hand, or do you want to let Excel do it for you? So, doing these calculations by hand, like I said, that's not fun. So, for this, I do recommend that you use the tool that's provided within Blackboard, that Excel spreadsheet that's provided in Blackboard. Now, here's the thing. We've determined the critical path. We've determined the slack for each task. So now we need to find the crash cost per week for each of those each of those steps in the project, each of those tasks in the project. Then, once we have this crash cost per week, well, we look along the critical path and we see which of these tasks is cheapest to crash. In other words, which task on the critical path has the smallest crash cost per week. So we crash that until one of three things happens. Either we meet our deadline, we get to 11 weeks, and life is good. More than one critical path exists. If that happens, well, we'll talk about that in a minute. Or no more crashing can take place. In other words, we've crashed that particular task as much as we possibly can, and now we need to select another option to crashing. So, here's the information we have. We calculated the crash cost per week based on the crash weeks and crash costs. So, for instance, with task A, it has a crash cost of $3,000, and we are able to crash it 2 weeks. So the crash cost per week is 3,000 divided by 2 is equal to 1,500. In the same way with task B, we have a $600 crash cost, and we are able to crash it 3 weeks. So 600 divided by 3 is 200. So we figure out the crash cost per week for all of those particular tasks. Now, again, there is one other thing that we need to be aware of, and that is a task on a critical path? This is something to be careful of. After all, if it's not on the critical path, it's not going to help us. Crashing it is not going to help us. So, what do? We look for the tasks on the critical path, and we see the task or combination of tasks that crashes all critical paths. Now, what this means, well, we'll talk about over the course of the next few minutes. So, we have a number of tasks, but you'll note that of the tasks that are on the critical path, remember, it's the tasks on the critical path only that can help us. It's a task that the lowest crash cost per week is task F. So, it's the biggest bargain. It's the best bargain. So, of our options available to crash, crashing at task F is the best option available. So, we're going to crash task F. Now, the question is how far should we crash it? Well, something that's a good idea to look over when you're crashing a project, and that is, what is the slack on the non-critical tasks? And the reason for this is that the slack on the non-critical paths is what can tell you how far you can crash before the possibility of another critical path showing up occurs. So in this case, the smallest slack on a non-critical task is 1 week. So we can only crash for 1 week before reevaluating the problem. So we crash task F for 1 week, reducing it from 3 weeks down to 2. Now this will cost us $600 because that is task F's crash cost per week. So that said, since it saves us $1,100 in costs from one less week that a project is in operation, it is clearly a good investment. So we crash task F. So here's our new project. We've crashed task F, so we've recalculated our earliest start, earliest finish, latest start, because we have to do that if we crash a task, because the earliest start and earliest finish for one task will definitely affect the earliest start and earliest finish for another, and by extension, latest finish and latest start for the others. And we see that there's a problem, isn't there? All of a sudden, we have 2 critical paths. This tends to happen when we crash a project. All of a sudden, tasks that had some slack don't have that slack anymore. And we're certainly finding that here. So now we have 2 critical paths. We have critical path A, C, E, and we have critical path A, C, D, F. Now, here's the thing. If we crash only one of these critical paths, it doesn't help us. The reason why is because if we crash A, C, D, F, if we crash D or crash F and that's it, well, that doesn't help the other critical path. The other critical path will still take 12 weeks. So, in the same way, if we crash E, and only E, for critical path ACE without doing anything for critical path ACDF, then that other critical path will take 12 weeks. We have to crash all the critical paths if we want to reduce the completion time for the project. So, which option, which task or set of tasks gives us the smallest price for doing that? So, because we have these 2 critical paths, we have to crash both critical paths if we want to reduce the completion time of the project. So, what do? We make a list. We make a list of the options that are available that will crash both critical paths. Well, task A is on both critical paths, so crashing A will crash both critical paths, so that's an option. Crashing C would crash both critical paths, so that's also an option. Or we could crash both D and E. D's on one critical path, E's on another. So crashing both D and E would crash both critical paths. Or we could crash both E and F. Again, because E is on one critical path and F is on the other, if we crash them both, that crashes both critical paths. So the question is this: which option crashes all the critical paths at the least possible cost? So let's take a look at our options here. We could crash task A by itself, and that would cost $1,500 per week. We could crash task C by itself, and that would cost $1,200 per week. We could crash both D and E, and that would cost us $800 plus $450, which is $1,250 a week. Or we could crash E and F, and that will cost us a total of $1,050 per week. So, which of these options is the best? Well, obviously crashing both E and F, because that is our cheapest option here. So, we compare these options and we see that the best option is to crash both E and F for 1 week. Why 1 week? Well, we can't crash F any more than that. That's the limit that we can crash F. Now, it's important to note that that'll cost us $1,050, but since we saved $1,100 from reducing the length of the project, it's still a good investment. So, we crash both E and F, and that takes the length of a project down to 11 weeks. So, here's our project at 11 weeks after we've crashed it down to what we want it to be. We see that there are 2 critical paths, ACE and ACDF. And, well, we've crashed F about as far as we can go. We've crashed, might have to crash E some more, who knows, if we wanted to crash it further. But here's our project, down to 11 weeks, down to our goal. Now, well, you'll note, here's what our project looks like now. We've crashed F 2 weeks, and that cost us a total of $1,200. We've crashed E 1 week, and that cost us $450. So the total here is $1,650 to crash it down to 11 weeks. That said, well, we saved $2,200, didn't we? We saved $2,200 by reducing the time for this project by 2 weeks. So we did well overall. We got it done. We got it done before this deadline. Now, let's think about one last problem. Suppose we wanted to crash the project further, down to 10 weeks. Well, which task or tasks should we crash? Well, what are our options here? Well, we could crash A, which would cost $1,500. We could crash C, which would cost $1,200. Or we could crash both D and E, which combined would cost us $1,250. Well, we'd go with the cheapest of those. We'd go with task C. That said, is it a good investment? Well, not really, no. After all, to do that, it would cost us, well, $1,200, but we'd only save $1,100. So probably wouldn't be a good investment in this case. Anyway, so that is crashing. I'm going to give a brief summary of the steps involved with crashing in the next video, and that should take care of it for project management, for the videos for project management anyway. Until then, be well and take care.